Okay, well, it's Friday for me. Hopefully you guys are watching this video at some point today too. I'm hoping to get it done very soon and get it to all of our wonderful AP Psych students. So we are in Unit 5, Cognition, and we are in Module 33, which is Forgetting, Memory Construction, and Improving Memory. We are going to really be focusing on forgetting and what are the different components of forgetting and how does it happen and why. We're going to also be looking at repression, Freud's theory on repression, and some people that maybe disagree with that theory. We're going to look at the reliability of eyewitness memory and more specifically look at it with children's eyewitness memories. And then we're going to, of course, end another with more helpful hints of how to make sure that you are making best use of your memory and encoding and storing and properly retrieving those memories. So we're going to begin with a quote from William James. If we remembered everything, we should on most occasions be as ill off as if we remembered nothing. So if you recall, William James was one of the first psychologists when psychology first began as a discipline. He was a functionalist. And he was basically, what he is saying here is that, if you remember too much, it can almost be as bad, if not worse, than remembering nothing, is really his point. And the reason why we bring that up is because we're going to be talking about forgetting today. And here is a woman, her name is Jill Price. She has an incredible memory. She remembers every day of her life since age 14 with clarity and details. We consider that a very, very detailed episodic long-term memory. We would also classify it as continual flashbulb memories. Here is a quote from her. Whenever I see a date flash on the television or anywhere for that matter, I automatically go back to that day and remember where I was, what I was doing, what day it fell on, and on and on and on. It's a nonstop, uncontrollable, and totally exhausting feeling. Actually, I'm adding a little word to that. So the reason why we bring it up is that she has such detail of each day of her life in her memory that in itself, like I said, forever flashbulb memory, forever episodic memories, but you can see how exhausting and overwhelming that would be. So she is the opposite of forgetting. So here is a very, very famous case study of somebody that has like profound memory loss. His name is Henry Molaison, and we also refer to him as HM. He had a lot of his hippocampus removed because of seizures, and it resulted in severe disconnection of the remaining hippocampus. And it made it so he was unable to form new memories. And he could keep a conversation going for a little bit, but then if he got distracted, he would completely forget what he said. And he is not able to form new memories, so nothing just stays with him. And we learn a lot from case studies like that. So, researchers from California, they're preserving his brain and they keep looking at it to try to understand more of what's happening and what causes these problems. So one thing that we've definitely found is that when it comes to physical causes of forgetting, we would normally call that some type of amnesia. And there are two main types. There's anterograde amnesia, where you can't form new memories, which was what HM had. And then there's something called retrograde. And I remember retrograde because I think of the word retro, and I know retro means like in the past. So that helps me remember that is where you can't remember your past. So if I remember retrograde, then I just know the anterograde is the opposite one. So it just, as it says here, it's an inability to retrieve information from one's past due to illness or injury. So let's look at this example here. Which of the following is an example of anterograde amnesia? So the answer is C. Lewis can remember his past, but nothing since experiencing a brain infection 4 years ago. So he can't make those new memories. Let's look at this little cartoon here and which type of amnesia is this? So this is the other one, retro, because now he can't remember his past, whether he actually ordered or ate already. So why do we forget? I love this visual here because, we talked last week about sensory memory, how you have lots of information that's coming in and it's not necessarily going to make it to the next phase, which is the working and short-term memory. And if you look here with all these little dots, you see, the smells and tastes and all your different feelings that are coming in, and they're not necessarily going to start working through the other forms of memory. So you can see here that much less information working to go into the working and short-term memory. And then even less that makes it to the long-term. But just remember the long-term, once it's there, it can stay there. And we, as much information as possible can make it there. If it does, the storage itself is limitless. All right. And then we retrieve from long-term memory, but sometimes there is going to be some form of forgetting that happens at any one of those stages. And forgetting is when you just lose the information. So different ways. It could happen at the encoding stage when it's coming in. It could happen at the storage stage where it's trying to go to the actual different memory systems and stay there. And then also you can forget things where you're just trying to pull it out of storage and you're just stuck. You can't pull it out. All right, so here are the specific ways that we might forget. We might have encoding failure, which is just, it doesn't get encoded properly. And then there's another example where over time, you just could lose what is actually in storage. And then the last thing, as we mentioned, that you could just have trouble retrieving the information. All righty, so I paused the recording for a moment, and the reason was because I want to do a little memory test with you. What was in the background behind me at the first part of this video? It was on this wall. Did you encode that information? So that is a really good example of if you cannot remember, or maybe you might have a false memory if you see my videos in the past and making a wrong assumption, that would be an example of encoding failure, that maybe you just didn't notice it, you didn't pay attention enough to it. And you, if that happens, that is a form of forgetting. It's never actually making it to the storage, into the working and short-term memory portion. It might be a fleeting moment that you saw it, but it just did not get stored. So that would be one form of forgetting. And I'm going to pause the video again and put the picture back up there, and then you can check to see how you did. All right. It's a zebra picture. All right, so that was encoding failure. So if that's when you're just not paying attention, it never actually gets encoded. The other way that you can forget something is what we call storage decay, that over time you just lose that information. So here is a really good example. Ebbinghaus, he liked to study nonsense syllables like Y-O-X and J-I-H. And he noticed that about 30 days later, that he had forgotten a lot of that novel information. And so basically, so novel means like new information not as familiar with, you haven't practiced as much. And so we call, so his studying and his research that he did and his own little experiments, he developed some theories. And one of his theories is something called the forgetting curve. And you don't want to forget the forgetting curve. And this is one way that I remember, is when I see something about the forgetting curve or I'm referencing it, I just create this little visual, because what happens is that pretty quickly after you have learned information and you're not having to actually use it, you're going to lose a lot of that information. You're going to forget a lot of it, but then it starts to level off over time, right? So I just do this. You lose a lot and then it levels off. So let's look at an example here that you're going to be familiar with. They found a similar, they did their own research studies, more recent than when Ebbinghaus did his research. And they found that a similar forgetting curve happens when you are learning Spanish, and that when you first leave the class, like let's say you took Spanish this year, when you first leave the class, that pretty quickly you're going to forget a lot of what you learned. But then what you actually start to remember after this year, the next couple of years, you're going to remember kind of indefinitely. It kind of levels off. Right? So, unfortunately, that's what happens. You spend all this time sometimes in a class and you do forget a lot of it, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to forget the big themes and the overall importance of the class. All right, so another way that forgetting can occur is something called retrieval failure. And that is where you actually have it in long-term memory. You can see you actually have it, but when you're trying to bring it back up into your working short-term memory, which is making it, conscious and you're aware of it and you're working with that information, that you can't actually pull it up from long-term memory. And so that one thing we want to just tell you up front, one way to make that not happen is the more that you rehearse and practice information, the more quickly you're going to be able to retrieve it, and more of the guarantee you'll be able to retrieve it from long-term memory. All right, so there are different ways. So just like there was types of amnesia, which is just forgetting, these are types of forgetting that has to do with interference, something that's blocking something else. So just remember, the word interference means something is interfering or something is blocking something else. So there are two types of interference, and proactive interference is when you have older information that you've learned that is blocking new information. You're trying to learn new information. So it says, so that old stuff you learned last month is getting in the way of the new stuff you're trying to remember now. So if something from last unit is blocking you from trying to remember the stuff for this unit, that would be proactive interference. Okay. Retroactive interference is when you have the new stuff you're learning is blocking you from trying to retrieve old memories. Okay, so we're going to give you another example here. All right, so if you buy a new combination lock, your well-rehearsed old combination may interfere with the retrieval of the new one. Here's another example I would give you. Like, let's say you move. When you first move into your new house, your old address is going to block you being able to remember your new one. So when people ask you, oh, you just moved, where'd you move to? And you start to recite your old address, that would be an example. And then the opposite, it would be retroactive interference, is like, say, a year that you've been living in your new house. Okay. So now when somebody asks you, oh yeah, you used to live over in that old neighborhood, what was that address? And you can't remember it. That's going to be retroactive interference. And here's the example here. They say, if someone sings new lyrics to the tune of an old song, you may have trouble remembering the original words. So I think they even give you more examples here. Proactive, you changed your email password last week, but you still keep typing in the old password. Retroactive, your teacher gives a cumulative exam covering all 10 chapters from the first semester, but you can only recall the most recent material, not the chapters from the beginning of school. So that's where the new is blocking the old. All right. I'm going to tell you a final note here. We talked about mnemonic devices last class, and we said that there are something called acronyms, which you guys are very familiar with. I will tell you that there is an acronym for this. I'm going to let you kind of figure it out for yourself. And it might make you chuckle. And it does have to do with, proactive, old, blocking new, and then retroactive, new, blocking old. And it is a AP psychology, like across the country. It is an acronym that students use. All right. We're going to move on. We'll do that in class. All right. So here is a graph, and it says for you to interpret it. I'm going to kind of give you just a heads up. It's just basically talking about the impact of sleep and how that can have more things potentially or not potentially interfere depending upon how much sleep you get. And let's look at this. Let's look at the research here. That information presented in the hour before sleep suffers less retroactive interference because the opportunity for interfering events, sorry, I have something blocking here. Interfering events is minimized. So it just basically means that when you are sleeping, there's less opportunity for things to interfere, and especially when it comes to retroactive interference. You just want to get sleep anyway, right? You need it to help you remember. So here's another concept. This one's called motivated forgetting. All right, so by the way, any of the people that maybe forgot to watch this video or they forgot to do their slide decks, it may very well have been something we call motivated forgetting. So sometimes when there's something that you don't enjoy, you don't want to do, that it just seems to, you just keep forgetting about it. It's like you kind of put it in another place. And, sometimes people might say it's avoiding, but you truly keep forgetting because you're just not motivated to do that particular thing. So it says memory is unreliable, self-serving historian. Sigmund Freud suggests that people may forget unwanted memories either consciously or unconsciously. In other words, they may be motivated to forget. And what we're going to talk about with the next concept with Freud is, a real example of where you're highly motivated to forget if it is something very traumatic. So let's look at this example here. Suzanne gets a new phone number. Each time she tries to give someone the new number, she gives her old one instead. The fact that her old is blocking the new, what do we call that? That is proactive interference. The old is blocking the new. All right, so here's an example of researchers told some participants, but not others, about the benefits of frequent toothbrushing. Those individuals informed about the benefits of the toothbrushing then recalled more than the others did, having frequently brushed their teeth in the preceding 2 weeks. So here they have some benefit to remember certain things, and then they tend to be remembering things much better than the opposite. And in this study, let's look at and try to discover what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable. So researchers told some participants, not others, about the benefits of frequent toothbrushing. And then it basically had some form of a memory test after. So the independent variable would be that whether or not they were told the benefits of toothbrushing. And then the dependent variable is going to be how well they perform on the memory test or how much they actually recall after. So the reason why we bring this up is because we're talking about motivated forgetting. Here is an extreme form of motivated forgetting, which is called repression. And Freud is the first one to really kind of discuss this. He had some patients that he felt They seem to just have no memory of really traumatic events that happened to them. And so he believed that because it was so traumatic, that it just banished from consciousness because it was so anxiety arousing and stuff like that. But the big but here, there are a lot of researchers today that disagree, and they've done further studies. So a lot of his studies were actually just individual case studies, anecdotal studies, as opposed to he didn't, research thousands of people. These were just patients that came to see him as a physician. So the studies that have been follow-up ones have actually kind of said that's not true. And we actually learned in a previous class about how, memories can be much more vivid, especially when there's emotion tied to it. So Margaret McKinnon would definitely disagree. She interviewed passengers who had died in a plane, or who nearly died. Sorry, that would not make sense. Nearly died in a plane crash. And they actually had very vivid, detailed memories of the traumatic event of the plane crash. All right. Oh, here's a little question for you. Which president was Alexander Hamilton? All right, write down that answer. All right, so we're going to talk about this. We actually already talked about this when it came to the Picking Cotton video, and you actually saw Elizabeth Loftus in person in that video. So what is the misinformation effect? It's when misleading information has distorted one's memory of an event. And she is really the main researcher that looks at this. And like I said, we're looking at faulty memories with eyewitnesses. She did a really famous study. Now, this one, we have not talked about that yet. So definitely pay attention, take some good little notes here. She did a really interesting study. She had two groups of people watch a film of a traffic accident. So they watched the exact same film of the exact same traffic accident, but asked them different questions. So one group, she said, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And the other group, she just said about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. So she was giving them misinformation, or they're asking what we would call maybe a leading question. Using the word smash is assuming that the cars were going much faster, and it generates more emotion. And so their interpretation and their memory is going to be influenced by that leading question. So a week later, whether they recalled seeing broken glass, people who heard smashed were more than 2 times as likely to report seeing glass fragments. In fact, the clip showed none. So for them, in their visual, and it became this reconstructed memory of the event, they became, in their mind, they depicted a much faster and more serious crash than what had actually occurred. All right, so here we tricked you. Ha ha ha. If any of you put that Alexander Hamilton was, and he gave one of those answers, which is very similar, remember, in the Picking Cotton video, where she was having to pick a suspect or pick someone that she considered, that had committed the crime. She was given this group of people she had to choose from, and the person that had actually committed the crime was not even in the lineup or not even in the pictures. And that is the same thing here. There's a lot of times that people misremember and assume that Alexander Hamilton was a president because we see him, especially with the musical and all that, very significant person from our history, but he was not a president. All right, so how does imagination impact our memory? So when we are, anything that's creating a lot of imagery and it's generated from emotion, we are more susceptible to imagining something that's inaccurate. Right? I mean, imagination is great, right? Creativity and all that. but sometimes you might actually get it mixed up of whether did I imagine it or did it actually happen? And I think we've all experienced that at one time or another. Did I imagine I was watching the video or did I really watch the video? Well, guess what? You're watching the video. Okay, so sorry to move on. How can digitally altered photographs produce imagination inflation? When Slate magazine readers in 2012 were shown a doctored photo of US President Barack Obama and Iranian President Mohammed Ahmadinejad shaking hands. I know I need to work on how I pronounce words and names specifically. But anyways, let's go back to the point that it was a doctored photo where they're shaking hands. 26% recalled the event despite it never having happened. So it was just a doctored photo. And then they actually now remember the event when it didn't actually happen. So here's another concept here, and that happens when it comes to certain types of forgetting. There's something called source amnesia. And source amnesia is where you, and we also call it the misattribution, you misattribute. So meaning you maybe might remember something, but you are wrong in what the source of that information, where you actually learned it, okay, or whether you imagined it, and you misattribute it. So it's called the misattribution effect, or it's called source amnesia. All right, here's some examples. We may recognize someone, but have no idea where we've seen the person. We may tell a friend some gossip only to learn that they got the news from that friend. So you're thinking it was somebody else. A friend who tells you about an internet story about a woman who had 75 cats, you know you have heard the story before, but can't remember where. So here's a very famous study, and sometimes they do ask you this one on the AP exam. And so these preschoolers, they interacted with Mr. Science, who was a teacher that was engaging them in activities where they were blowing up a balloon with baking soda and vinegar. And then their parents read them a story describing some things the children had experienced with Mr. Science, and some they had not. So basically, they read them a story where there were some things they actually did do with Mr. Science and some that were just like in the story. And you can probably predict what happened. So when a new interviewer asked what Mr. Science had done with them, did Mr. Science have a machine with ropes to pull? 4 in 10 children spontaneously recalled him doing things that had happened only in the story. They recalled a false memory. So just because they heard it in story and now all of a sudden they imagined it, and that imagination like created a false memory. So one of the famous study quotes is memory is malleable. There's a lot of things that can influence it. Ooh, this one's a good one. What is deja vu? It's that eerie sense that I've experienced this before, and it is eerie. And some of us are almost scared when we have deja vu experiences. But one thing I want you to recognize is that a lot of your previous experiences are stored in your memory. And sometimes there's little triggers that start to retrieve some previous memory into like your current working memory and your current experience. And also source amnesia can actually make you feel like you've experienced something before. All right, so how can we tell true memories from constructed ones? It's hard to separate false memories from real ones. False memories can be persistent and feel like real ones, and we more easily remember the gist than the events themselves. All right, so we'll talk about this in class, be thinking about sometimes that you remember, that some aspect of an event was actually false. All right, so another big controversy is that when repression the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approach was really, really widely used, especially back like in the 50s, 1950s, 1960s. And there was a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists that were working with patients, helping them, in therapy for different reasons. And they would sometimes be asking what ended up being kind of leading questions to these patients. And they would basically start to say they remembered experiences that maybe actually never happened. So some of the informations they were finding, like, for example, that somehow they were asking some type of leading question that would make them feel that they had some memory of some type of sexual abuse. And it was what like we said, we know now, it's called the misinformation effect. Now, it does not mean, I'm going to make something really clear here. It doesn't mean that that repression never occurs. But it's just saying that we have to take into account and recognize and try to be as objective as possible, and making sure we're not asking like leading questions where the misinformation effect could come into play. So traumatic experiences typically lead to vivid, persistent, haunting memories, as opposed to not remembering, is what we've found generally. When memories are recovered after long periods of amnesia, particularly when extraordinary means were used to secure the recovery of a memory, there's a high probability that the memories are false or some level of it. Okay, but we want to make these final notes. Sexual abuse actually does happen. Injustice happens. Forgetting happens. Recovered memories are commonplace. Memories of things that happened before age 4 are unreliable. We know that with infantile amnesia. Memories recovered under hypnosis are especially unreliable. And memories, whether real or false, can be emotionally upsetting. So there's it just, once again, when it comes to human behavior and us trying to understand something like memory, it is very complex. And there's a lot of different variables and factors that are going to be involved. All right. So the last part of this has to do with eyewitness memory and the reliability with children. And I am just going to give you the very quick summary of it, that they basically just found, and you already can make predictions, what you've already learned throughout this particular module and the previous module and watching the Picking Cotton video, that, if there's any type of question that can be potentially misleading, that children's reliability of their eyewitness memory is going to be, it's not going to be reliable. So you have to take that into consideration. Obviously, if a child does need to be used as an eyewitness, then they will to a certain degree, but understanding that the opportunity potentially for false memories, inaccurate memories, and that it's not going to be highly reliable. All right. So that kind of jumped through that very quickly. Here are the last thing I'm going to tell you. Memory research findings. We want to study repeatedly, make material meaningful. Hopefully you had some connections today with what I was talking about. Activate retrieval cues, use those mnemonic devices. I gave you a suggestion to use one for the proactive and retroactive interference. Try to minimize your interference. So maybe you had to take a couple breaks watching this video today. Get a good night's sleep. And there's actually going to be a snowstorm coming up, so you'll probably have more opportunities. And test yourself to be sure you can retrieve as well as recognize the material. All right, here's my last little question. My husband came through the door. Do you remember what he was wearing? All right, so I'm going to pause this real quick, come back on in a second. I'm going to bring him back in here. All right, so did you remember what he was wearing? Did you have that? Did you have the mask on around your neck when you came through the door a little while ago?
Yes.
You did? Okay. All right. All right. So how did you do on that memory test? All right. Have a good day. Take care. Bye. Okay.